How on earth has another month passed already? Good Lord, I need a winning lottery ticket, a vacation, and some more horror novels. Not necessarily in that order. Well, as I said, another month has passed. We are now boldly venturing forth into August of 2023, which would seem to indicate that July is over and that the spooky season is just about upon us. How that happened, I have no idea, but that does mean it's time for my monthly roundup and review of all the books I've read over the past month. As you know, if you've been around this channel for a while, I focus mostly on horror, as this channel is focused on horror, because obviously that's the best genre in the world, but I also do read a little bit of everything, so let's embark on another odd and eclectic mix of books that I've read in July of 2023. I started off this month with Horror Store by Grady Hendrix. If you've been around this channel for a while, you know I've read several of his books before, but this one, though I've known about it for a long time, just hadn't come to the top of my reading list yet. But I finally rectified that early this month. As Hendrix is known for, it's a quirky sort of a book, a quirky sort of a horror story. In this case, it's basically about a haunted store that bears remarkable similarity to IKEA. And if you like the idea of a horror story set in a store that's really not IKEA because the lawyers made us say so, then this is certainly going to be your cup of tea. The references to the furniture and the names of the furniture and the store layout are all quite amusing. But putting aside the whimsical setting and furniture references, it's a fairly run-of-the-mill haunt story. It's very well told and the characters are quite interesting, but the setting and the references are really the things that sort of set it apart from the rest of the pack. That said, it was a great start to this month's reading, and perfect if you're looking for something a little bit on the lighter side, but you still want to stay within the horror genre. While we're on the topic, I'd be remiss though if I didn't mention another book that I read not this month but many years ago, of which Horror Store reminded me quite a bit, and that's The Store by Bentley Little. Bentley Little is usually reliable for a good horror story, and The Store is in fact another good one. Instead of not IKEA, as in the case of Horror Store, this one takes place in not Walmart, and in place of Hendrix's quirky and lighter story, Little's is a lot darker and more of a traditional horror story, but they're both good in their own right and both worth reading. It's been quite a while since I read The Store, but I still remember it well. Next up, we have a non-horror book. As I mentioned, I do occasionally sprinkle some of those into my reading. Again, those of you who've been watching this channel know that my reading habits tend to be rather eclectic. Well, here's one I doubt will appear to very many of you, so I will be brief, but I enjoyed it. The book is A First Course in Graph Theory by Gary Chartrand and Ping Zhang. Yes, it's a math book, so many of you probably are tempted to switch this video off. Don't, I'll be back to the horror shortly. But one of my degrees is in mathematics, so you know, I love this kind of thing. But I never actually took graph theory in college. I spent my time on game theory and number theory and combinatorics instead, and I wanted to learn a bit more about graph theory, and I knew one of these authors from a different textbook that I actually did use in college, so I gave it a read, and I have to say, it's quite a fun introduction to the topic. I'd already learned a lot of what it talks about elsewhere along the way, but it's full of further explorations and historic notes that I found quite useful. So if you do happen to be a math person, I recommend it. But for everybody else, I suspect that everybody else includes most of you, let's get back to some spooky stuff. The next one on my list is In a Dark Place. Now the cover lists a bunch of names, including Ed and Lorraine Warren, and Carmen Reed, and Al Snedeker. But the actual author of this book was Ray Garton. Those of you who pay attention to paranormal lore will be very familiar with the Warrens, about whom I've shared my thoughts elsewhere on this channel. Reed and Snedeker, on the other hand, were the people whose allegedly true story was the basis of the novel. And for reference, this is the book on which the Haunting in Connecticut movie was based, so you know what we're talking about if you haven't read it. The basic story involves a family moving into a house that used to be a morgue or a funeral home because they need to be closer to their son's oncologist. As you might expect in a horror story, things don't go particularly well for them. And as you'd certainly expect if you've read anything at all about the Warrens, it ain't just a ghost, but a demon they have to deal with. Mercifully, though, most of the book is the story of the family, and the Warrens themselves only make a brief appearance toward the end of the story, so that's rather nice for people like me who don't particularly care for the Warrens. Another thing you ought to know is that the actual author of the book, Ray Garton, does not stand by this book as a true account. In fact, you'll notice this tagline at the top says, "The accounts of the demonologists featured in the film The Conjuring," which is true, but nowhere does the word true appear, as it does on all of the other Warrens books in this series. And that's because Garton won't allow it to be reprinted with the word true anywhere on it. In fact, when he was working on it, he once approached Ed Warren and explained. He said the family's story was contradictory and just nonsensical. He couldn't make any sense of it. And Warren said something to the effect of, "They're all crazy, just make it up and make it scary." And thus was born this particular novel. And I do call it a novel because it is a novel. It's not really a true story, despite some people's claims to the contrary. So my thoughts here are a bit mixed. It's a good book, as are all of Ray's books, and as long as you treat it as a work of fiction, it's very much worth reading. Just don't think that it has any real truth behind it. Next, we again make a quick and brief detour from the horror genre and look at some books I'd read before, many years ago, but needed to reread because it had been too long, and those are the Federalist and AntiFederalist papers. Obviously, these are must-read books for anyone interested in American law or history, or in fact law or history in general, I would say. These are the newspaper articles the Founding Fathers published to explain their thinking when they were arguing for or against ratification of the Constitution. The Federalist Papers, written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, lay out the case for the Constitution, and the Anti-Federalist Papers, written by a wider group of thinkers, lay out the various objections or misgivings about ratification. Taken together, they present a fairly complete portrait of political and legal thought in the late 1780s in the United States. There's a common thing we hear these days that the Constitution itself is rather opaque, in that it must be impossible to know what the Founding Fathers actually meant when they wrote certain clauses. Well, with all due respect to the people who say that sort of thing, nonsense. They wrote it down. So these are certainly some of the most important American legal books on the market. And I have to say, I particularly like this version of the Anti-Federalist Papers because it includes this chart here, which arranges the papers by subject and tells you which Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers spoke to each issue. The one complaint I have about both of these particular editions is that the publishers, Bantam and Signet respectively, didn't update the books when the Constitution was last amended in 1992. So while the Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers themselves are as they were in the 1780s, the appendix in each book containing the text of the Constitution is missing the 27th Amendment. That's a small oversight. I just wish that these books had been published before, so it's understandable why it wouldn't have been included originally. I just wish that as they reprinted them, they would have put that back in so that it would be more of a complete reference. Admittedly, these are slower reads than many, so unfortunately I have only one more book to share this month, but that is another return to our favorite horror genre, and it's a book called The Sick Box by Matthew Fries. This is one that was sent to me recently for the purposes of review, so I read it with that in mind. And it's an interesting one. It tells the story of a damned soul climbing the corporate ranks in hell and trying to possess a living child. It's a sort of light horror comedy rather than straight horror, which is rather what I needed toward the end of this last month, so I enjoyed it. The idea in this book of describing hell as a corporate office full of all of the various corporate doublespeak and office politics is a perfect idea, and the book itself is a fun ride through supernatural horror and comedy. I'm not going to claim it's the best book ever written, but particularly if you're tired of corporate nonsense, it's definitely one you'll want to check out because it's a lot of fun to read, and for me, it was just what I needed when I happened to read it. This particular edition was published by a now defunct press, but the book in a different edition is still available, and in fact, I'm informed that a sequel is in the works and should be out sometime toward the end of this year, so we'll have to stay tuned for that as well. Anyway, that brings us toward the end of another video. Perhaps a bit briefer than usual, as I only made it through 6 books this month, but hopefully I still turned you on to something you're interested in reading. If that's the case, you can find purchase links to all of these books down in the What's It, where you'll also find links to my various other projects. While you're at it, do be sure to like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, share this and all of my videos with as many people as you possibly can, and most importantly, as always, take care and stay scared.